Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. One more time. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Indiana Landmarks Center. My name is Marsh Davis, and I'm president of Indiana Landmarks, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, which we call The Value and Values of Preservation, a talk by Donovan Rypkema. This program will provide a preview of an important study of the impact of historic preservation in Indianapolis that Indiana Landmarks has commissioned in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission. We wanted to commemorate this important milestone with a useful product that backs up with real and ample data what you and we have claimed for many years, that preservation, and in particular, local designation through the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission, has real and lasting value. To get this done, we hired the best in the business, Don Rypkema and his colleagues at PlaceEconomics, and it's an honor to have Don with us tonight. I'd like to begin first with a word of thanks to those who have made financial contributions in support of this study and of this program. And they are Sally Rowland, Bradbury Associates, Sally Cook, Helene Cross, the Ephraimson Family Fund, Dr. George Geib, Joanne Green of Land Story, Inc., Jim and Marjorie Kinley, Andre Lacey, Randy Sheppard and Amy McDonald, and Jane and Frank Walker. Thank you all for your support. I also want to thank those of you tonight who are members of Indiana Landmarks for your support now and through the years. Thank you. If you're not a member of Indiana Landmarks, we invite you to join us and support historic preservation here and throughout Indiana. If you see any of our staff members with these name badges on, they'd be happy to accommodate you. I'd like to call out some special attendees this evening, starting with our friend at the helm of the Department of Metropolitan Development, Emily Mack. Emily? Good. And the man who, for just shy of 30 years as the administrator of the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission, has been a constant force for our cause, David Baker. David is backed by a wonderful group of dedicated commissioners, and we're honored to have with us tonight another preservation champion, the president of the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission, Mr. Bill Brown. Bill? And are the chairman of the board of Indiana Landmarks, Dr. James Fadley. Jim, where are you? Oh, right in front of me. All right. For all here tonight who have served on or have served on the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission, please stand and accept our gratitude for your selfless dedication to historic preservation in Indianapolis. Past and present members of the commission. Anybody? Oh, yeah. If you've ever watched Channel 16 at 11:45 and the commission's just halfway through their agenda, you know that these people carry out a great service to our community. Thank you all. Great to have you here tonight. And here, representing Mayor Joe Hogsett, is our wonderful Deputy Mayor of Community Development, a man who knows that historic preservation is essential to good community development, and he's a valued former staff member of Indiana Landmarks. Please welcome Deputy Mayor Jeff Bennett.
Thanks, Marsh. I love being in a place where David Baker gets the biggest round of applause because he just blushes and does not necessarily enjoy the spotlight. I know I only have a couple of minutes, and that is difficult because when I used to give talks related to historic preservation, they included at least 30 minutes of slides. And I mean slides like in a carousel with the clicker that And I told that to Tina Connor, and she said, yeah, I think Jim Glass still uses slides. I said, yeah, Bill Selm probably does too, and I hope they both do because that's just perfect. My slides would begin with the buildings that we lost, and I think there were three that I always started my talks with. Two of the three I think everybody in the room could probably get: the English Hotel and Opera House, the Marion County Courthouse, and my third one was the Traction Terminal building. But after we showed what was lost, then I'd go into the before and afters, and those are the ones that were super powerful. Slides of once boarded up houses in Lockerbie Square and Ransom Place on the Old North Side, where rehabilitation sparked an ongoing 40-year renaissance in our city's historic neighborhoods. Slides showing the decline and rebirth of the wholesale district in the 1990s. And those slides showing revitalization of neighborhood commercial corridors through restoration and adaptive reuse. I think it's okay for me to say in this group among friends that the preservation community has at least two moles working in city government today. So between Emily and me, there's preservation in our DNA, along with what I'm sure is probably lead-based paint. To say that the city supports preservation goes beyond just the two of us. As Marsh just mentioned, the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission recently celebrated its 50th anniversary by declaring Old City Hall and the P.R. Mallory Industrial Campus as locally protected landmarks. And we also are supporting the nomination of the City-County building to the National Register. And we're putting our money where our mouth is. An incomplete list of adaptive reuse projects that have been approved for some kind of public financing support during the Hogsett administration's first 2 years includes the Hessler Naval Armory, the Bethel AME Church, the Ford Assembly Plant on East Washington Street, and as the slide showed, the Coca-Cola bottling plant on Mass Ave. 3 of those 4 will be preservation tax credit projects. And we're not done yet. In 2018, we hope to get to work at both the P.R. Mallory site and finally, hopefully, once and for all, the German Church in Cumberland. The Hogsett administration understands the cultural and aesthetic importance of saving places that matter. We also understand the now obvious economic impact, the financial power of historic preservation. I worked at Landmarks in 1997 when Don Rypkema's first preservation of property values statewide report was completed. And the body of research in that field was not vast at the time, so we sort of fingers crossed, hoped that the data would show what we all felt in our hearts. Now we know. And I look forward to hearing Don speak in just a moment to update us on his great work in this space. And I appreciate that opportunity to be here tonight representing Mayor Hogsett. Thank you again.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I should have mentioned, too, that Emily Mack began, early in her career at least, was an intern at Indiana Landmarks. So we're so proud to see the great trajectory of our alumni from Indiana Landmarks. And we just hope that you stay in public policy all the way to the federal level so we can get some good heads in Washington and get stuff done that we need to, like the tax credits. So stay with us. And now to introduce tonight's speaker, I welcome to the podium a tremendous preservation leader at all levels, from the local trenches in Evansville to the state level where he served as visionary leader of Indiana Landmarks, to the national level where he is now trustee emeritus of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Indiana's former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a man that we at Indiana Landmarks are proud to claim as our honorary chairman, Randall T. Sheppard. And we asked Randy to introduce Don for a number of good reasons, but chiefly because Randy and his wife, Amy, have been close friends with Don for many years. And for several of those many years, during the annual national preservation conferences throughout the country, by far and without exception, the most stimulating discussions, most intellectually advanced thinking happened not at any of the great plenary sessions or symposiums. They happened in a crowded hotel suite somewhere during the conference, during the Sheppard, McDonnell, Rypkema parties. So I see tonight as an extension of that grand tradition. So, Mr. Chairman, would you please do us the honor of introducing tonight's speaker, Randall Sheppard. Right.
And as with tonight's party, there was a little alcohol to be had that helped us get where we needed to be. Earlier today, I had a chance to chat with Don, and one of the topics that he and I and David Baker and Marsh mused on briefly was the incredible changes that have happened in American life, particularly in technology, that have changed how we talk to each other, how we communicate, how we learn things, and of course, have changed the economy. It set me to thinking this afternoon about the changes in the public dialogue about historic preservation that have likewise occurred in these several decades since Don and I first met as members of the Board of Advisors in 1982, most likely in the fall, almost exactly 35 years ago. Now, in the era when Don launched his venture, Real Estate Services Group, in the commercial capital of South Dakota, a place he usually just calls Rapid, we were in the middle of the earliest debates about the value of preservation sort of out in the country. And what that meant here in Indiana was the debate about the Meridian Street Preservation Commission, about the IHPC, the debate in Evansville about the Evansville Historic Preservation Commission, all happened in that decade. And if you went to one of those meetings in that period of time, you could pretty much count on what the opponents would say. We knew what we would say, but we also knew that there was a sameness about what they said. And it almost always was, this will hurt the value of my property in the neighborhood where I live, over and over again. And we know now, 30, 35 years later, as Deputy Mayor Bennett has said, that exactly the opposite has turned out to be the case. And it had to be the case. If you took a derelict building in the middle of a neighborhood, an empty warehouse, and turned it into a useful place, other people felt more secure in making their own investments down the block or around the corner, and it was bound to work. And so it has. In the 15 years between 2000 and 2015, something genuinely remarkable happened in American cities. The populations in the core counties of America's metropolitan areas grew faster than the populations in the suburbs of those same metropolitan areas, and that was the first time that had happened. Exactly the opposite had happened over and over and over, all the way back to when Harry Truman was in the White House. Now, the reasons why that's true and still true will sort of ring true for us as we sit here, if you will, almost in the shadow of what is now called the Salesforce Tower. A report from Australia that caught my eye that said what we now know about the heart of economic development, that a competitive economy for a city in the 21st century requires a concentration of knowledge workers, and that knowledge workers are the kind of people who choose where to work and live depending on the quality of the environment, and that historic preservation and adaptive reuse are crucial components to a high-quality urban environment. Now one might say, why has it turned out so well? Why has this happened over these decades? And there are a lot of reasons. But I put it to you that there's one very powerful reason: Don Rypkema. The mayor of Akron just summoned a summit to talk about how they could expand the city of Akron, how they could build a more livable city. And when he and his allies were asked by the newspaper, how would this summit do that? They unabashedly said, one way to make sure that that's the way it will turn out is to recruit Don Rypkema to talk about laying the right foundations to make it happen. Don has studied and analyzed and advocated about historic preservation all over the country and the world. His book on the economics of preservation, now in its second printing, has been translated into languages other than English so that people in Asia can take care to use these same principles and approaches that have been so successful for us. He has assisted cities and urban planners and for-profit entities and not-for-profit groups in 49 states. Who's the holdout? Nevada? Yeah. Nevada? We'll take care of those guys. we'll get those guys. 49, Nevada. Oh, who'd have thought? 49 states and 30 countries, where overseas his clients include people like the World Bank and the Council of Europe and the National Trust of Australia. And he's lifting up the next generation of preservation leaders by teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's won teaching awards, and of course, the most significant award in the whole preservation movement, the Crown and Shield. It does not try to prove too much to say that thousands of people, at least hundreds of thousands of people, live better lives because of the way Don Rypkema has lived his. You know that Amy and I consider it one of the great good fortunes of our life to be your friend. And we thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Don Rypkema.
Yeah, ordinarily I would say I would make some smart-ass remark about, Randy being on retainer to say such nice things, but everyone would know I couldn't possibly have enough money to pay a retainer from that. So, Randy, that's mostly wrong, but true. Randy and I did meet at a National Trust. First time we met was a National Trust conference in New Orleans in 1982. And there were two things remain in my mind about that conference. One, the most important, is my friendship, 35-year friendship with Randy began. But here was the second one, is on Saturday mornings, the last day of the trust conference, there would be kind of open forum sessions. And I was a small-scale real estate developer and appraiser from Rapid City, South Dakota. And one of the sessions, a group this size, I walked in the back door, and there were serious debates, heartfelt debates, about whether real estate developers should even be allowed to register at the National Trust Conference. That there was this kind of, and that was kind of the alien there, and that there was no role for the real estate community to be involved in historic preservation at all. And thank God it's decidedly different now. And part of that, I mean, I have my tiny little niche of a so-called career that is this intersection of historic preservation and economics. That's kind of what I do. We do study stuff, we do other stuff, but the common denominator is that connection between historic preservation and economics. And I sincerely believe, in spite of that, I sincerely believe that in the long run, and the title here that Marsh's crew came up with, the value and values of historic preservation, I sincerely believe that of all of the values of historic preservation, that in the long run, the least important of those values is the economic value. That the aesthetic and social and cultural, environmental and cultural value is vastly more important in the long run than the economic value. But the great British economist John Maynard Keynes said, but in the long run, we're all dead. And in the short run, those who have power to influence what happens to historic resources, and that's mayors and deputy mayors and city officials and bankers and real estate appraisers and developers and investors, they do care legitimately about the short term. And so this little issue about this economic nexus of preservation, while in the long run less important, I think needs to be in our toolkit. And that's really what this is about. So I did this study 20 years ago for Indiana Landmarks for Reed Williamson, great mentor and guide for me for all those years. And the other thing I should say about Indiana, so I love being in Indiana, and the other thing that I have to tell you, because he really helped set the groundwork for what Indiana has become. I knew of Bill Hudnut when he was mayor and when he was in Congress, but I didn't know him. It was just a name on a newspaper story. But when he settled in Washington and joined the Urban Land Institute, I became a good friend of his. You're a good friend of mine. He often had me do things for the UL, and he is a guy who really told me himself. He said, "Yeah, I was never a big preservationist." He said, "But when I was mayor and the terrible condition that Center City, Indianapolis was in," he said, "I really understood that needed to be part of the equation." And so in the end of his career at the Urban Land Institute, he was one of the biggest champions there was about preservation-based urban redevelopment in both center cities and in close-in suburbs. So that's why I'm thrilled to be here. When Marsh contacted us about doing this study, he said, "You know, this is the 50th anniversary of the Landmarks Commission, and we'd like to have this study be a part of that." And so we talked about time schedules, and the reality was that we couldn't, by the end calendar year, finish everything. So you're going to get a kind of sneak preview. We're probably 70% of the stuff that will get done. The rest of it will be done shortly after the first of the year, but at least there's enough to give you a kind of taste of what we're learning and what preservation means and continues to mean in Indianapolis. Oh, and I need to turn this thing on. Can't see. The other thing that Randy said that's absolutely right is this change in technology. Literally, the way two things has really made possible what we're learning in cities in Indianapolis and elsewhere today, and that is really two things: the emergence of big data, the fact that you can get information about a lot of stuff on a geo basis. There's some word for that. I don't know what it is. Kind of a spatial basis. But then a bunch of young people who I've been smart enough to hire who know how to do that. I don't know what GIS stands for, let alone be able to do it. But in fact, we can kind of tap. And so much of the stuff that you'll see, really, we have been able to get because of the kind of how the technology has changed, even in the last decade. So you all know this, but kind of to set the ground for what we did. Our kind of approach in this is to look for patterns in historic districts that are a different pattern than in the rest of the city. And we cast a very wide net to do that. Much of that you hear tonight is about real estate and property values, but we tossed the net wider than that. So here's what you have here. You have local historic districts, and that's where most of our effort was. You also have 5 conservation districts, and then there are 19 National Register districts. And as you all know, that a number of the local districts are also National Register districts. So the 19 are National Register districts that are not also local districts, or that part of that National Register district is not in the local district. And we try to tease out what the differences are in those 3 levels from what's happening in the rest of the city. And again, you have this interesting combined city-county government here. So you have a massive area, and a couple of the National Register districts are outside the urban, what we were referring to as the kind of urban Indianapolis. I think the kind of compact area or something is what the city documents. So much of our analysis is in that area because it's kind of where the most germane comparisons are. And I'll tell you kind of when we make comparisons what area we're looking at. And then we really concentrated, as Marsh mentioned, on these local historic districts, on the purview of the Landmarks Commission. What's really happening there, and how does that contrast with what's happening elsewhere in the city? So here's what it is. And we looked at the area of the city, and again, we're talking about the urban Indianapolis. What share of the parcels, the lots, in the urban area are under the purview of our historic districts, local or conservation district or National Register districts, and how much of land area. And so you see about 92% of it is not in anything. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be, but it's not. It's not under any of those categories. That by parcels, about 5% of the parcels in urban Indianapolis are in local historic districts, and another couple percent in either conservation districts or National Register districts. By area, about 3.5% of the area of the land area of the urban area of Indianapolis is in local historic districts. So we're talking about statistically a relatively small amount of area, which makes all the more important the kind of differences that little area has on the whole of Indianapolis. Now, I know that all of you came here tonight so we could discuss this chart about the economic concept of revealed preference. And I could do that. Actually, I couldn't, but I could pretend that I could do that. But instead, I want to explain this concept of revealed preference by this. In that we could do a little survey here. We could say, who prefers chocolate, who prefers vanilla, and half of you raise your hand on one and the other. And that's just a survey thing. And that's a stated preference. I prefer chocolate. I prefer vanilla. But there's another way, and that's this tool of revealed preferences that we, in the alternative, we could have back where the liquor is, we could have a whole bunch of bowls of ice cream, half of them vanilla and half of them chocolate, and we could see the preferences based on which kind of ice cream you took. And that's really a lot of what we look at uses this revealed preference is that we don't ask people, do you like historic districts or do you want your business there? We say, how do you act? What do you do? And what does that tell us about your preferences? Your preferences are revealed by your actions in the marketplace. And again, Randy talked about, Randy and I didn't coordinate our presentations, but he's absolutely spot on this critical component of growing economies, of competitive cities, and that is you need to have a concentration of the knowledge worker. You just do. You just do. So here we have Indianapolis, that the local historic districts constitute 3.6% of the land area, but that includes 16% of all of the jobs. And when you think about that, it's even more impressive than the number itself is the vast majority of the historic districts are in fact primarily residential. And yet, 16% of all the jobs in the urban area of Indianapolis are in historic districts. 21% of the jobs in food and accommodations are in historic districts. And what does that say? It means that's two things happen. Restaurants is where people go to gather and have fun, and accommodations are where visitors go. So you have these historic districts that are disproportionate draw for those activities. And then look at the last one. It's professional, scientific, and technical services. Those are those knowledge workers. And even though 3% to 3.5% of the land area is 16% of the jobs, but 28% of those jobs in those fields are, in fact, in local historic districts in the city of Indianapolis. And so that's exactly what Randy said. It is the revealed preferences of the people hiring those workers to be in those kind of character areas in local historic districts. Startup jobs. About 2% of all of the jobs in Indianapolis are in startup firms. But again, with 3.5% of the land area, but 16% of the jobs in startup firms are in historic districts. So people are saying, I want to start up, I want Indianapolis to be where I kind of grow my company. They're choosing disproportionately the historic districts. And then this larger area where most of our research to date has been, and most I'll share tonight has been, and this issue about real estate. It really is true, is that this set of assumptions that Randy talked about, Historic District Commission is going to have rules. Rules means another hurdle, another governmental hurdle to have to go through. Prima facie means it's going to have an adverse effect on property values. And consistently around the country, place after place, regardless of methodology, who did the research, in fact, the opposite has been shown to be true. So here is, we looked at property values, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pieces of data. And we used the assessment records in Indianapolis, and we got the data from the year 2000, but the first 3 years must have been a kind of funky assessment thing because the numbers made no sense. Where the numbers began, where there was kind of a logical sequence, was in 2003. So that's the base of our numbers. And most of you will know this. For those of you who don't, there's this thing called indexing. Is that when you want to compare numbers of different scales on how they move, you make them all equal at the given point. So we took the average square foot value on the assessment records of single-family residences in the year 2000 and assigned them a value of 100. And then say, how did those values change over the next 13 years? I don't think this has a little thing. But so this is the line, this is all of the properties in Indianapolis that are not a historic district. And what that line is flat. It's largely flat. It went up a little. We had the real estate crash. It fell, and it's kind of stayed at that lower level. All three of the other categories of properties, local historic districts, conservation districts, and National Register districts they're not in local district, every one of those outperformed the rest of the properties in the city. So if you wanted to make a good investment in residential real estate in Indianapolis, pick one. In every case, you're going to outperform the city as a whole. But we can do it also by numbers. And again, the usefulness of assessment data. I used to be a real estate appraiser, and if you asked me to give, the value of your house, a specific house, I probably wouldn't just trust what the assessor says it's worth. But the advantage of it is there's no kind of bias. First of all, the universe is huge. Every property in town is included on that. And if there's an error, and there will be, it's going to be awashed in kind of all the sheer quantity of data. And when we're not necessarily looking for a number, but patterns of change, assessment data is the best way to look at. Again, look at what happened. At the beginning of the period, the yellow line is the properties in Indianapolis not in historic districts, on $1 per square foot of that full and true value on the assessment. Again, in 2003, average value in the rest of the city was higher than any of the categories of historic districts on average, beginning of the period. What's true at the end of the period in 2015, the latest data available, in every case, the average value of those properties in every one of those categories is in fact more valuable than on a per square foot basis than the rest of the properties. So here is this kind of reward of preservation. But then the issue, and we had a couple of press interviews this morning, and one of them asked a very good question, saying, well, aren't those numbers skewed by maybe you have a real big success story and kind of raises the average? So we looked at individual local historic districts, every one of which performed better over the 13-year period than the rest of the city. Some of those are very wealthy districts, some of those are the opposite of very wealthy districts. It didn't matter. Every one of them had rates of appreciation over that 13-year period better than the city as a whole. And again, if you kind of recall this time frame, you had the early 2000s where real estate was kind of going up on lunatic ranges, and then you had the big real estate crash, and then you had a recovery, and so this time period covers this whole cycle of real estate. And over that period, who came out best? Well, the local historic districts. It's also nearly always true in the National Register districts, that with kind of one kind of funky example that I don't know the districts well enough to explain, all the National Register districts outperformed the city as a whole. So people are paying attention, and this is movement. People are not moving into the city randomly. They're moving into neighborhoods of quality, and that's being reflected in what's happening to these values in historic districts. There's the city. There's the change in the city between 2003 and 2015, a little up, but and then one's a kind of statistical toss-up, all of the rest of these National Register districts did better than the city as a whole. Here is a really big deal. We used the same database, but looked at a different time frame, and we looked at 2008, which was kind of the first year of the real estate crash. So what happened? Property values all over town went down. All over the country went down. But what happened in the recovery stage? Well, local districts, they improved the most. They took their hit, then ended up with values today greater than at the beginning of the crash. The conservation districts were about a toss-up. National Register districts did better. But look at the rest of the city. In fact, the average per square value today in 2015 is less than it was in 2008 at the beginning of the crash. So there is this counter-cyclical thing. It's not the massive state economy. It is the peculiarity of these historic districts that it kind of gives it what we refer to as the preservation premium. Now, I guess both of the reporters this morning said, well, why is that? What causes that? I think it's really three things. One is the character and quality of those neighborhoods that has a wide appeal to a whole bunch of people. That's part of it. A second element is proximity issues, and I'll talk about some of those as well, but the nature of how cities grow, that the older historic neighborhoods tend to be closer to the center, and there's some proximity advantages to that, so that's part of it. And the third thing is that shows up in the local districts but not in the National Register districts, and shows that difference in advantage, is the protection that that local preservation ordinance provides to the property. And it's not that anybody's paying a premium to go and appear before David's goofy commission. They're paying a premium for the confidence that the lunatic across the street is not going to be able to do something to his property that has an adverse effect on the value of my property. And that's showing up in the marketplace. And this is the revealed preference. People are saying, I mean, you might say, do you want more regulation or less regulation? Everybody's going to say, I want less regulation. But how they act, the revealed preference is, I want to be in that place where the quality and character of my neighborhood, in fact, is protected from change. Here is, I think, maybe one of the most important of all the findings. Here we had this biggest financial crisis since the big crash of 1929. Millions of people lost all of their assets in this real estate crash, and it resulted in a lot of foreclosures. And so we purchased the foreclosure data from the height of the crisis, from 2008 to 2012, and said, what happened here? One household, and again, we looked at single-family residences, 1 in 4 houses in the city of Indianapolis faced a foreclosure action over that 4-year period. That's how serious it was. But look at what happened in the local districts and the conservation district. Less than half of the rate of foreclosure. Well, HUD, FHA, Bankers Association, savings ought to be paying some damn attention here. A huge difference in what was lost. Now, is that because if you live in a historic district, you never get divorced, or you never lose your job, or never run your credit card too much? No. I think what's happening is that if I get in financial trouble, there's a kind of latent market out there where I can get that property sold before I get to that foreclosure stage. And we're seeing it. This is not a fluke. This is not a fluke, and we've now looked at about 31 cities around the United States in this foreclosure pattern. This is always the answer, that the foreclosure rates are between 1/3 and 50% less in the historic districts than they are in the city as a whole. That's a big, big deal. But once again, to say, well, maybe that's disguised because some of the rich neighborhoods, they didn't have any foreclosures. So we looked individually at all of them. Every local historic district had foreclosure rates decidedly less than the city as a whole. That's a huge, huge contribution. Now, the answer clearly isn't, oh, well, then let's make the whole city a historic district. You won't have any foreclosures. That's not the issue. There are qualities and characters of those neighborhoods where this shows up. What I will say, it also says there's a whole bunch of Indianapolis that certainly qualifies for a local historic district that isn't. And one of the kind of policy outcomes ought to say, should we have more historic districts? And then the National Association of Realtors every year does a great analysis of what has the biggest adverse impact on the value of housing. And the #1 adverse impact is having a vacant and abandoned housing within 500 feet of your house. Has the biggest negative effect. So we looked at the vacant abandoned housing in Indianapolis. There's almost 3,000 of them. You know how many are in historic districts? 58 out of 3,000. So here you have, once again, 7.5% of the land area in historic districts, 1.8% of the abandoned housing are in historic districts. Once again, it kind of builds on each other. So that's the kind of real estate side, but there's also some kind of quality of life things that Randy's discussion of young people moving into cities, they're looking for something different than was suburbs, and they lump those in quality of life things, and a lot of those are proximity things, some of which are public transportation. And so we looked at both bus stops and bus routes in the city of Indianapolis, and we said how many are within a quarter of a mile of your residence. Well, and for bus stops, 90% of houses in historic districts are within a quarter mile of a bus stop. And 90% are within a quarter mile of the bus route. Decidedly greater than what's true in the rest of the city. Again, this is a proximity issue, but it's one of those quality of life contributions in those historic neighborhoods. Then we looked at proximity to parks. And once again, much greater likelihood of being within a quarter of a mile of park if you're in a historic district than if you're not. And then we look, because I know this is a big emerging thing in Indianapolis, the bike lanes. And the same answer is that citywide, 24% of houses are within a quarter of a mile of a bike route, almost 40% in local historic districts. So it's this kind of combination of urban quality things for which the local historic districts just are added value. We cast a wide net. We don't have a preconceived notion of what we're going to look at. We just kind of gather a bunch of stuff and say, is this anything telling us? And when we were my colleague Bree and I were here at an earlier trip, Marcia's staff suggested, well, you ought to talk to the people at Keep Indianapolis Beautiful, because they do some interesting things. So we went there and got a great kind of preview, and they talked very proudly about their Adopt-A-Block program and put up a map. And Bree and I, not experts about Indianapolis, said, wow, those kind of areas kind of look familiar. So we went back and we overlaid all of their Adopt-A-Block programs with historic districts. Well, once again, in parcels, a number of parcels, historic districts only constitute 77.5% of the parcels in the city of Indianapolis, but almost 18% of the Adopt-A-Block programs are in those historic districts. Again, it's not so much that it's an Adopt-A-Block, but it's this symbol of community engagement. It's kind of commitment to the neighborhood that really is reflected in this. And then kind of to close, and then I'll be happy to take whatever questions you have, there's this great program that Indiana Landmarks has had for 40 years. And we took their easements, but the reality is almost all of those easements were a reflection of something else. They made a loan, they made a grant, they bought the property, rehabbed it, sold it, whatever, but there was some action on the part of Indiana Landmarks that caused that easement to exist. So we looked at it decade by decade, and you're going to know the city to see the kind of ongoing impact this program has had. So there's the historic districts in the urban area and the little, that's what happened in the 70s. And then that's what happened in the 80s. And then that's what happened in the 90s. And then that's what's happened since 2000. And so you can just see this growth of the influence of the intervention of Indiana Landmarks to the kind of first stabilization and then the kind of prosperity in those neighborhoods. So there's lots more to come when we will be through after the first of the year, but we've found really exciting stuff. And thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions. Any questions? I made up all the numbers, so you don't really care about that. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between industrial properties and residential properties?
The great question, is there a difference between industrial properties and residential properties? Because of the kind of comparability, we only looked at residential properties. And the reason is that the kind of motivations of a buyer of a house are largely the same. I want a place to put my family. Where the motivations for buying or selling industrial property are going to be all over the board, and there are just so many variables in that, in those choices, that I'd have a kind of tougher time suggesting a cause and effect on that case. Now, some of the stuff that we will include in the final report on kind of case study, sidelight story, will be some of the wonderful reuse of industrial properties, historic industrial properties, for other things. So we will look at that, but more on a kind of vignette case study basis than trying to quantify a value change that I think it would be tough to kind of say this is the cause of that value change. There are just too many other kinds of variables that aren't, which is why we kind of focus on the single-family residential stuff. Yeah. Yeah, we have done specific city-like studies, like we're doing in Indianapolis, in Raleigh, Savannah, San Antonio, Pittsburgh, and New York. We're currently doing Indianapolis and Miami-Dade County, and right at the first of the year we're going to do Los Angeles. What I'll say is that the data is very consistent in terms of a whole range of things, in terms of the property value change, in terms of the attractiveness of historic districts for knowledge workers, creative workers, startup businesses. The foreclosure thing is even stronger here, but it's kind of true to a pattern. So I think it is consistent with other findings, and by extension, you can say, well, then it may be true in other places. I mean, as my kind of researcher side says, I don't want to say that the fact that we found this in Indianapolis means it would be true in Madison, Indiana, but maybe. But I think that the evidence is really consistent with findings elsewhere. I think that one of the two really strengths of stronger in Indianapolis than other places is the huge diversity in the local districts, both sometimes within the district, but in the aggregate, there's huge diversity within those districts in terms of race, income, property value. That's really a very positive thing. And I think that the extension of this, that there is no kind of fixed citywide, this is our only design guideline approach, where you really think about how districts are different and respond to them in different ways, is also a strength, a very level of sophistication that most cities don't have. So I think that's a kind of, from a kind of implementation thing, a strength as well. Yeah.
So you talk about all the benefits that accrue to the historic districts. How do you look at correlation versus causation?
Yeah.
So all of these benefits that in terms of bike lane, bike transit, it's correlated. How do you determine that that's causal?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's did everyone understand the question? So you have all this great data, but how do you know? How do you sort out which is a cause and which is just a correlation, but not causality? I think that the clearest, and again, you're really right. I mean, there are some of those contributions, particularly the ones in proximity, on the proximity basis, that are probably going to be some value increment created by your proximity to a bike trail, for example. That would be true whether or not. So that's a place where I think it's correlation and not necessarily causality. But I think the strongest evidence is in the difference between historic districts that are under some form of regulation and those that aren't, where largely the rest of the components are the same kind of character of the neighborhood and same kind of proximity advantages, and the only difference, the single difference, is that one has protection and one doesn't. And so I think that one's pretty clear. But in all candor, if I were doing a kind of dissertation, I'd try to see if I could drill down to see exactly which of those components is specific to the historic district, its contribution, as opposed to the locational other factors. So I think there's no, in kind of already too long a response to your answer, I think that this premium, this preservation premium, is attributable to lots of things, including but not limited to the character and quality of the resources in the district. But I think that's a very legitimate question. Yeah. Yeah. About a third of the work of our firm is international. And a year ago, we did a project for the Culture Ministry in Abu Dhabi about creating incentives for the historic resources. And as part of that process, we did a really thorough research on incentives around the world to attract private capital into historic buildings. You know, everybody wants to raise their finger and say, we're number one, we're number one, we're number one, and I'm dubious about a lot of that. But one place that absolutely the United States is number one is the federal historic tax credit. There is no better incentive for preservation in the world than what we have in the United States for historic tax credit. And as we speak, it's being debated on the Senate floor. And I'm telling you, and the House version of tax reform axes it entirely. And it's only the kind of intervention of a couple senators over the last 2 weeks that a version of it has been put back into the Senate bill, and who knows what will happen. I'll tell you, if that goes away, a huge share of your extraordinary success, and this is where the commercial side does come in, particularly in downtown Indianapolis, but also in the commercial neighborhoods, will be gone. The buildings that you have seen come back to life will not come back to life without that tax credit. I'm telling you, that wonderful Coca-Cola plant, that ain't going to happen if there's not tax credits. It works. Just isn't. And a whole bunch of really stuff. So it is critical, and it is driven not because it costs too much or it's inefficient or it doesn't work. Nobody in Congress is making that argument. Nobody. The only argument is an ideological one. We don't think the tax code should be doing anything but raise money to pay, for battleships. And so we get rid of everything that's kind of these taxes. It's just idiotic. So if we lose it, I'm telling you, we lose a huge amount all over the country. There has been no more effective tool for urban revitalization, forget preservation, for urban revitalization than has been the historic tax credits. And those people moving into center cities, they're moving in to restore historic buildings, and that's going to be lost if that tax credit is lost. Time for one last one. I see Marsh signaling me, so. The question is, any data on a change in investment when a national register becomes designated? No. The straight answer is no. And my intuitive sense is this, that in many, but not all places, a commercial historic district will see an increased investment because it's the national register listing that gets access to use the federal tax credit. So I think that there will be a pattern in many, but not all places, of that happening. I think what happens in again, this is just intuitive, in residential national register districts, that the first impact is not necessarily a huge wave of investment, but it is a rallying flag for the neighborhood that says, we're something special. We got on the National Register. And we actually, in a number of meetings we've had all day, talked about this really important role of the kind of neighborhood association, neighborhood group in both stabilizing neighborhoods and kind of encouraging this. And I'd say that a National Register district in a residential basis, its kind of first impact might have longer term and kind of increased investment, but the early is going to be really something that the neighborhood say, we're something. They made us a national register, so that's my kind of best guess on that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Don. I think you can see why he is so popular throughout preservation movement and why his services are really in demand from around the world. Great presentation. We can't wait to see the final results. But if you want to see the final results, I encourage you to put in your calendars the Preserving Historic Places Conference, Indiana's statewide historic preservation conference, which will be held in Columbus this spring, April 17th through 20th. Don will be back with the final results of the study. We also hope to have sometime in early February the document itself, which will be available on the PlaceEconomics website, so you don't need to buy a copy of it. You can download it yourself and read it. And also, I would encourage you, when you do that, to look at the other studies that Don and his colleagues have put together. They're very wonderful. They're all different, but they lead to generally positive conclusions to what we're trying to do. If you want to check for updates on the Preserving Historic Places Conference, please check out the Indiana Landmarks website, indianalandmarks.org, and you'll find updates on the conference and on registration. Now, we're going to give you a brief preview of a documentary produced in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission. It's produced by WFYI, narrated by John Kroll. I think most of us in Central Indiana know him from the No Limits program, and he worked on this during Don's last visit. I've not seen this, but we're going to see a preview. So roll it, Alan.
A city's image is not only shaped by what it builds, but also what it chooses to save. Not all that long ago, treasures from the past were bulldozed to make way for new development. But that's changed in Indianapolis through the creation of an active historic preservation movement.
I think we're at an interesting point in time where cities have been rediscovered and millennials and others are moving back into the city. But for the preservation of those structures, Indianapolis downtown wouldn't be such a special place.
It's not come without battles, but Indianapolis is a richer place because of efforts to retain the past in the present.
Well, we're glad to see that Mayor Goldsmith has come around to our point of view after all these years. I was expecting to see Don Rypkema talking about preservation. Anyway, if you want to see Don talking about the preservation, Thursday, December 7th, 7:30, WFYI. Tune in and watch the whole program. Anything else for the good of the cause? Thank you all. Great program. Thanks for being with us.